I used to think I was pretty good at world building. I had notebooks full of history, detailed maps with trade routes marked out, a magic system with internal consistency that I was genuinely proud of, pantheons with clear hierarchies and domains, factions with competing interests and long-term goals. I'd spent months building this world before my players ever sat down for session 1, and I was so ready to show it to them. And then we started playing, and man, my players forgot the factions within 2 sessions, they'd nod politely when I described the historical significance of a location, then immediately ask what loot there was in the room. They treated the world I'd built like a nice background, sure, nice to look at maybe, but ultimately just a background decoration while they did the actual playing. At first I thought it was a player problem. Maybe they weren't paying attention, maybe they didn't care about the story, maybe I had the wrong group for this kind of campaign. But then the more I ran games, the more I started to notice a pattern. Different players, different tables, with the same results. They'd engage with some parts of the world intensely and completely ignore other parts I thought were just as important, if not more so. And that's when it finally clicked. This wasn't a player problem, this was a world building for play problem. I'd been building worlds the way that you'd write a novel or design a video game, not the way you'd actually run a tabletop RPG. I was creating something meant to be observed and appreciated, when what I needed was something meant to be used and changed and broken by player choices. Every mistake I'm talking about, I made. Some of them I made repeatedly because I didn't understand what was actually going wrong. But fixing these mistakes, understanding why they happened and what to do differently, that's what turned me from someone who could build an interesting world on paper into someone who could build a world that actually worked at the table. So this isn't a list of bad ideas, these are good ideas that became unplayable or forgettable, or that just didn't land the way I thought they would when people were actually rolling dice and making choices. Before we get into the mistakes, I need to define what I mean by good world building for D&D. I think a lot of us are aiming at the wrong target. Good world building isn't about depth and consistency, or how much lore you've written. Those things can be part of it, but they're not what makes a world work at the table. Good world building for D&D means 3 things. Your players can make informed choices because they understand enough about the world to predict consequences. The world reacts to those choices in ways that feel logical and meaningful, and the setting feels like it existed before session 1, and will continue existing after the campaign ends. Like your players are participating in something bigger than themselves, rather than walking through a theme park built specifically for their adventure. That's the standard, and these are the 10 mistakes that kept me from hitting it. Mistake 1. Building a museum instead of a playground. The first big mistake I made was treating my world like something meant to be admired rather than something meant to be interacted with. I'd create these elaborate histories explaining how the current political situation came to be. I'd design architectural styles and I'd write out theological disputes that led to the schism in the church 300 years ago. And it was all really good stuff. Genuinely interesting world building that I was proud of. But it didn't create pressure, it didn't give my players anything to do. It was just there, this beautiful backdrop that they'd occasionally glance at while they tried to figure out where the actual adventure was. Players engage through doing, not through knowing. 1,000 years of dwarven history is impressive, but it doesn't matter at the table unless the history creates a problem the players need to solve, a choice they need to make, or a consequence they need to deal with. Every major detail in your world should create one of those 3 things, or it's just set decoration. Mistake 2. I was building all the pieces of my world in isolation from each other, and I didn't realize I was doing it until way too late. I'd work on a magic system for a while, get that feeling internally consistent and interesting. Then I'd shift over to factions and design a bunch of competing groups with different goals. Then I'd think about geography and how that shapes cultures. Then I'd layer in some history. And all these elements were fine individually, but they didn't connect to each other in a meaningful way. So when I'd present the world to my players, they would hear about the magic system in one session, the faction conflict in another session, some geographical features in the 3rd session, and none of them would stick because their brains couldn't find the pattern to latch onto. It was just overwhelming pile of disconnected facts. What I learned to do instead is use a hub and spoke approach. Pick one core idea for your world, one central concept that makes it different or interesting, then make everything else a consequence of that core idea. That way when the players learn about the magic system, it reinforces what they know about factions, and when they learn about the geography, it connects back to the history. Everything supports everything else because it's all flowing from the same source. Mistake 3. I thought being a good world builder meant having an answer for everything. If a player asked how magic worked, I should be able to explain it. If they wondered why nobody had invented magical trains yet, I should have a reason. If there was any gaps or inconsistency in the lore, I needed to fill it. So I'd create these incredible detailed magic systems where every rule was clearly defined and every edge case was accounted for. I'd write pages and pages of history that explained exactly how everything came to be. I'd make sure there was no contradictions, no mysteries, no questions I couldn't answer, and it killed the sense of wonder. Mystery creates curiosity. When players don't know exactly how something works or why something is the way it is, they sit forwards and start asking questions and theorizing and investigating. But when you've explained everything up front, when your world is perfectly consistent with no gaps, there's nothing left to discover. You need to leave deliberate unknowns in your world, conflicting beliefs about how magic actually functions, lost historical records that nobody can verify, myths that might be true or might be complete nonsense. Those gaps aren't flaws in your world building, they're hooks for your players to grab onto. Mistake 4. This one's insidious because it feels like you're being nice to your players. The villain's plan requires gathering several different components, which will take 3 days to complete, but the party needs to go handle a side quest first. So his plan just pauses until they get back. A faction war is brewing and tensions are at a breaking point, but it conveniently doesn't actually break out until the party is in position to witness it. So the world waits politely for the players to engage with it before anything important happens. And on the surface that seems considerate, right? You don't want to punish your players for pursuing side content or taking their time making decisions. But what it actually does is kill any sense of urgency or stakes. If the world only moves when the players push it, then nothing ever feels truly dangerous or out of control. The world should change whether or not the party intervenes. Villains should advance their plans off screen and factions should act on their own motivations even when the party isn't watching. When your parties come back from that side quest, your villain's plan should be further ahead or maybe even completed. That creates pressure, and pressure creates investment. Mistake 5. I used to describe locations like I was writing a travel guidebook. You enter a tavern. It's made of a dark wood with a stone fireplace on the north wall. There are about a dozen patrons scattered around various tables. The bartender is a middle-aged woman cleaning glasses behind the bar. Technically accurate, completely forgettable. My players would nod along and then immediately forget everything I just said because there was nothing in that description that connected to them or their goals or their situation. Players don't connect with objective descriptions, they connect through perspective and relevance. Every location you describe should be filtered through danger, desire, or utility. What in this space could hurt them? What might they want from this place? How can they use this environment to their advantage? The same tavern becomes a lot more memorable when you describe it as, I don't know, for example, the tavern's too quiet for this time of night, and you notice most of the patrons are keeping their hands near their weapons. The bartender clocks you the moment you walk in, and you catch her giving a subtle nod to someone in the corner you can't quite see. Exact same location, completely different impact because now it's filtered through danger and immediately relevant to the players. Mistake 6. Fantasy worlds run on magic and wonder, right? So you can ignore practical concerns like food supply and travel times and how power actually gets enforced, right? Oh no. I learned this one the hard way when my players started asking basic questions I couldn't answer. What are they eating? This fortress is 5 days from the nearest settlement. How are they getting supplies? No matter how much you like magic, if the reality adjacent details don't hold up, the fantasy collapses too. Your player's suspension or disbelief is built on the foundation of basic logic. And if the foundation is shaky, nothing else matters really. You don't need to become an expert in medieval economics or military logistics, obviously, but you do need to ask basic questions about food, travel, power, and enforcement. Just having thought about these things, even if it's the lazy answer, magic helps with that. Makes the world feel more solid. Mistake 7. I was so hyped about my world building that I tried to shove it into the game every chance I got. Party traveling between cities? Cool. Let me pause everything and explain the centuries-long beef between two regions. They stop at an inn? Perfect. Now the innkeeper is suddenly an expert on local religious traditions. And to their credit, my players would sit there being very polite. None of it stuck. And it wasn't because it was bad. It was because they never asked for it. It wasn't helping them solve a problem or make a decision. It was just homework wearing a fantasy costume. Listen, lore works best when it's invited. When players uncover it through play, when they go looking for it or when they need to make a choice, or when it's tied to the real danger or clear reward. If the player asks, what do I know about this cult? And you give them 3 tight, useful sentences, they'll remember every word. But if you launch into a lore dump about the cult and why they're trying to plan their next move, it just turns into background noise. Mistake 8. I used to spend weeks building entire continents before a campaign even began. Multiple nations, each with their own governments and cultures and political drama, huge pantheons with layered divine defined hierarchies, timelines stretching back thousands of years, and I felt very prepared. Then the campaign would start in a tiny town, and suddenly none of that stuff mattered. Not for months, sometimes not even ever. That's the trap. Players don't connect with places that only exist on your notes. They connect with places they can walk through, argue in, break things in, and come back to later. Starting with a giant world map sounds smart, but it usually just creates a ton of prep that never actually shows up at the table. Or worse, it can make you cling to your plans because you've already decided how the world is supposed to work. What actually works is starting small. Start where the campaign begins. One town, one real problem, a few factions that want different things. Go deep there, because that's where your players are going to live for a while. Then, let the world grow outward naturally. Follow the player's curiosity. Follow the direction the story takes. If they never set foot in the Eastern Continent, guess what? You never needed to build the Eastern Continent in the first place. Mistake 9. Early on, every culture or faction in my world could be summed up in one sentence. Dwarfs were proud warriors who cared about honor and tradition. Elves were isolationists and obsessed with preserving ancient knowledge. The Merchants Guild, pure profit and political influence. It worked on paper, and it felt flat at the table, because real cultures don't work like that. They're messy, they're full of contradictions. You've got people arguing about what a culture is supposed to stand for, reformers pushing for change, traditionalists digging in their heels, and a whole lot of folks stuck somewhere in between. When you boil a culture down to one defining trait, it starts feeling like a cartoon and feels fake, and players pick up on that immediately. The moment you add internal disagreement, everything comes alive. Not every dwarf cares about the same traditions. One group wants to modernize, another is fighting to preserve the old ways, and most dwarfs are just trying to get by without blowing everything up. The tension makes the culture feel real, and more importantly, it gives players something to do. They're not just visiting a culture, they're choosing which side of an internal conflict they would get involved in. Mistake 10. This was probably my biggest mistake, and definitely one that took me the longest to unlearn. I thought that the setting had to be finished before we could start playing. Every city mapped, every NPC with a full backstory, every plot thread neatly outlined. I'd spend months prepping, and even then I'd still feel anxious about starting because there were gaps, things I hadn't figured out yet, and all the prep made me rigid. When players did something unexpected or unwanted to head in a direction I hadn't planned for, I'd push back, not obviously but subtly. I'd nudge them towards the stuff I'd already built, which, if we're being honest, is just railroading with a nicer presentation. The truth is, the world doesn't need to be complete, it just needs to be playable. You only need enough for session 1 to work. Build in layers, start small, then expand to the parts the players actually interact with. That flexibility is what lets the world grow naturally, shaped by player curiosity instead of GM anxiety. And honestly, some of the best world building I've ever done was right there at the table, made up on the spot in response to a player's question or choice, because it wasn't built in isolation, it was built to serve the game. So after making all those mistakes and slowly figuring out what actually works, this is what I landed on. A D&D world should be playable, reactive, and intentionally incomplete. Less lore, more pressure, less explanation, more consequences. Less museum, more playground. Your world doesn't need Tolkien level depth or perfectly airtight Brandon Sanderson magical system. What it does need is to give your players interesting choices and then respond to those choices in a way that matters. Everything else is optional. And honestly, once that clicked, world building became way more fun. So let me know in the comments some mistakes you've made world building and what you learned from them and how you do it now. Or if you're new to world building, ask some questions in the comments. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay spicy, adventurers.